Hi everyone, it's Stephen Lewis here. I'm an ARC Research Fellow at Deakin University in Melbourne, Australia, and I thought I'd use the opportunity with a bit of coronavirus lockdown to talk to you about the work I've been doing for the past couple of years if you are interested. Obviously, you're at this YouTube channel, then you are interested in education research and education policy sociology. So hopefully I can share some things I've been doing. We've got a cup of coffee, and we're just going to have a bit of a chat around some work of the OECD, or the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. And you might think, why am I interested in an organization that has an E that stands for economic rather than education? And I think that's a really good question. And it's been the focus of my research since I've been a PhD student, and then subsequently with postdoctoral research fellowships, and now an ARC DECRA fellowship. And the work I've been doing has looked at how the OECD has really moved beyond its focus on national schooling systems and the comparison internationally between how well these schooling systems do. So you might think of quite prominent education systems internationally, the likes of Finland, the likes of Singapore, the likes of Japan, and more recently Estonia as well when it comes to mathematics and science. And the OECD and PISA, or the Program for International Student Assessment, is a way that we basically get to compare how well countries are doing with a common set of metrics. So it's a common language, if you like, it's a common performance framework to understand how well your country does in reading, mathematics and science. At least that's how it's presented by the OECD. Now, there's a lot of very critical work, including work that I've done and work of many others as well, which has looked at the role of the OECD in terms of having global educational governance. Well, how does it govern what we think and do around education policy and practice? And as I've just mentioned, given that the OECD through PISA measures how well schooling systems perform, largely those effects, or PISA effects if you like, around the impacts on policy and practice have been at the schooling system level. They've been at the level of national schooling systems. The audience that's most receptive to those messages are quite often national bureaucrats or national policymakers or politicians, and then that's disseminated to the public more generally via the media. But what we've seen, and what my work has hopefully done over the last few years, is looked at how the OECD has diversified its policy message, and it's diversified its audience to whom it's speaking. It's no longer just talking to these national policymakers and bureaucrats. It's actually looking at to the school level and the teacher level in terms of informing how schools think of education, think of schooling, how do they go about planning their policy, how do they go about planning their classroom activities, and then even more specifically down to the level of the teacher. And you can see, hopefully over the course of this little video, through reference to some of the research and insights I've been generating, exactly how the OECD has sought to do that and how I've sought to understand those processes. So like I've mentioned, the OECD has been responsible since the year 2000 for a triennial test called PISA. It measures how well schooling systems perform nationally. But what we've seen is that quite often those national schooling system performance numbers don't generate interest at the school level or at the teacher level. And that's quite often where change needs to be enabled or facilitated if the OECD is actually going to be able to translate their policy messages from the abstract sort of policy level down into the classroom. And there's two particular instruments that I've been looking at for these past few years, which I think really typify the OECD in its attempt to broaden and diversify its policy message and ultimately expand its influence as a policy actor and as the global expert for education, even though I personally would see that as a very problematic assertion. One of these is PISA-based tests for schools, or more commonly known now as PISA for schools. And as the name implies, it's a version of PISA which doesn't measure at the international sort of and national schooling system level. You're not comparing countries anymore. PISA for schools actually takes those same PISA performance frameworks, looking at reading, mathematics, and science, but it uses those then to evaluate the performance of an individual school. And then because there's a common PISA framework and language underpinning those performance assessments, you're then able to compare the performance of an individual school to these international schooling systems. So for instance, a school in the US with whom I spoke over the course of my PhD and postdoctoral work would say things such as, we're doing better than Shanghai, or we're going to beat Finland on PISA. And even though, again, I would see that as a pretty problematic statement, given that a schooling system is clearly not a school. These are the sorts of comparisons that the OECD are making possible through PISA for schools. And they're the sort of frameworks and relationships that are being generated through teachers and schools and school leaders being able to position their school in a global space of measurement. And that global space of measurement uses this common language, like I've said a few times now, around PISA. And on the basis of that, you can make performance comparisons and then say, right, we're not doing as well as Finland, we're not doing as well as Shanghai, what do we need to do differently? And I think the real danger with that comes is that there's a sense of a universality. One way of understanding schooling, one way of understanding education, one way of measuring performance. And if the notion is that you can use one test and one set of frameworks to evaluate schooling across the world, then it really makes a bit of a sort of lie to the fact that, local school, local context, local cultural factors, local histories are really that important. The OECD really sort of emphasizes instead that it's policy and policy decisions and policy settings which really dictate and determine how well a schooling system, or a school in this instance, will perform. And I think that's part of the real danger with the performance comparisons enabled through PISA for schools, is that the underlying logic is that schools will get their performance comparison, see how well they compare to other high-performing systems, and if they're not doing as well as Finland, or they're not doing as well as Shanghai, they can think, right, what are the policy settings in place there? And then look to borrow those policy settings from Finland and put them into their school, whether it's a rural school in the US Midwest, or it's a metropolitan school in Moscow in Russia, or it's a regional school somewhere in Catalonia in Spain. And it doesn't matter necessarily where your school is. If your school wants to do as well as Finland or do as well as Shanghai, all you need to do is borrow those practices. And I would see that as very, very, very problematic. It's very damaging to actual educative policy learning, which can happen from understanding context, which you understand from really knowing what your class of students or what your school needs to best suit and best service its community. But importantly, it takes out all of that nuance, it takes out all of that complexity, and it just ends up with people sort of borrowing prefabricated off-the-shelf solutions. If this is what Shanghai does, then this is what I need to do to be as good as or better than Shanghai. And I think that really does create a lot of danger in terms of what it means for people to think, what do I need to do to best service my school and my community? Is it about understanding what my students need? Is it about what's understanding the local factors and settings and conditions that inform, the complexity of a school and its students? Does it provide any opportunity to think other than reading, mathematics, science, this very narrow definition of what it means to be learning at school, let alone broader notions of questioning what it means to have education? And instead, what we see with the PISA for schools is that you're having this universal off-the-shelf approach to what works in education. And I've actually, if you're interested, there's a paper I published back in 2017 called Governing Schooling Through What Works, and what works is very much in quotation marks, the OECD's PISA for schools. And you can find that at the Journal of Education Policy, like I mentioned in 2017, and the information for that paper will be provided underneath this video if you're keen to check that out and have a look. And if you can see there, judging by the title, I'm really trying to understand how the OECD sort of promotion of certain practices is a form of governance in itself. So once you set up the conditions for schools to look abroad, for schools to compare themselves in this universal yardstick of PISA, then it's almost like a foregone conclusion that you're encouraging them to not only look at how well they perform against other systems, but then compare their policy and practice settings to other systems, with the implication being if you borrow the policies and practices of a high-performing system, then you too will be a high-performing school, even though that completely does away and disavows any notion of understanding context or local settings. So that's some work I've been doing a little bit ago now over the last few years. More recently, since I've started this ARC DECRA Fellowship, I've been interested in the next sort of iteration of PISA, the next PISA-based product, if you like, of the OECD. And this is PISA for You. So PISA, P-I-S-A, for the number 4, and then the letter U. And you might ask, who is this you to which PISA for You is referring? What it is it's the next version, if you like, of PISA-based learning. No longer is it just targeting schools who participate in PISA for schools, but PISA for You actually takes those policy learnings of the OECD via PISA testing, and it's put them together into an online professional learning platform with a series of modules, with a series of online learning communities, with a series of video resources and publications and PDF files and the like. And basically it's an online learning platform for teachers to engage with, to connect with other users, and to share ideas of best practice. But the important thing is, even as they share those ideas based on their own experience, this is very much shaped and framed by the policy learning and by the evidence, if you like, that's generated by PISA. And when I've been saying these words, PISA and evidence and data and the like, please know that, there's ironic quotation marks around all of these, because even though the OECD would present this as evidence and present this as valid evidence, and in some respects it might be, but I think there's a real difficulty and a problem when this one form of evidence becomes the only form of evidence that counts, and then the policy implications and practice implications that stem from that can really be quite concerning. So PISA for You, this is really taking, again, things that were designed to measure broad system level performance at the system level with the PISA test, and now you're taking the learnings from that test and applying that to inform teacher professional development and ultimately teacher practice in the classroom. And I think the thing that's really dangerous with this is, again, extending on this notion of like universalized policy and universalized practice that I was alluding to before. What you end up with is one set of global classroom practices and global best practices for teacher learning being promoted all around the world. And to demonstrate just how powerful that is, if you look at the countries who participated in the PISA for You pilot in the year 2017, most of those countries weren't, of the most commonly participating countries by the number of participants, weren't actually from OECD member countries, and they weren't from even countries who participate in the PISA test. A lot of them were from countries who had no connection in any substantive way to the OECD or PISA. Countries such as India, Pakistan, Nigeria, the Philippines. And I don't name these countries to impugn them by any stretch. I think I name those countries because the absurdity of comparing a country with a very, very different local context to the normal countries who participate in PISA and who are members of the OECD. These countries of the OECD are very highly developed, high economies, high income nations. When you're comparing, countries that are developing, have very, very vastly different education systems and social organization, it's not a fair apples for apples comparison. So I think it's quite unfair to take learnings that are appropriate maybe for OECD member nations and say that these are equally appropriate to countries that are developing. I think the other danger with PISA for You is that, again, being online, it's accessible to anyone, anywhere, at any time. And this is really one of the selling points that the OECD uses to promote the PISA for You platform. This is a voluntary program. There are no costs associated with it whatsoever. So again, it's all there for free at the OECD, if you like. There's a bit of a marketing tagline for them to use if they haven't come up with one already. And I think, as demonstrated by the fact that a lot of these teachers who are participating in PISA for You come from non-OECD countries, developing countries that aren't as high income as the normal OECD country. I think that is really sort of exploiting the fact that quite often these teachers are working in conditions where they don't have access to professional development, or at least quality professional development. And again, this is not to impugn these teachers. These teachers are undoubtedly working very hard in possibly quite trying circumstances and want what's best for their students. And to their mind, a free online professional learning platform, endorsed by the OECD, stamped with the seal of approval from PISA, that credentials them as a teacher who is aware of international best practice is undoubtedly very, very compelling and very appealing. But I think the danger of that is you see these ideas then from PISA and the OECD being sort of infiltrated or colonizing, if you like, new parts of the world for whom hasn't been a traditional audience of the OECD and PISA. So it's a way for the OECD to gain a foothold, if you like, in new territory, gain a foothold with new audiences, and really promote the PISA brand and awareness of the PISA brand, so that potentially these teachers will take these learnings from PISA and employ them in their classroom and reference their own practice to the best practices, if you like, of PISA. And then potentially even more significantly, perhaps, these countries who have teachers involved in PISA for You then might encourage their principals, their district leaders potentially to say, well, we want to now do PISA for schools, or we want to now encourage the country as a whole to do the PISA test. So I think there's a real way to sort of use PISA for You as a means of generating brand awareness of PISA, more than it is to sort of focus on substantive professional learning and professional development for the teachers who participate. So you can see here across these two different products, if you like, of the OECD, PISA for schools and more recently PISA for You, just some ways in which the OECD is really trying to contribute to its own sense of self as the global expert for education and education policy in particular, but then how it's sort of transcending that focus on policy, and particularly policy at the national level, to move into these new subnational and more local schooling spaces, be it the school with PISA for schools, or even the individual classroom with PISA for You, the teacher professional development platform. And I think, again, this really looks to sort of crowd out other potential voices when it comes to questions around education policy and teacher professional learning and teacher professional practice. Again, teachers aren't the ones who are being asked to be involved in these things in terms of, well, what is best practice? Education academics such as myself and other university academics aren't the ones who are being asked to say, well, based on your research, what should be informing teacher professional learning? What should be informing the way schools approach education reform? Instead, it's the OECD, again, an organization that is putatively focused on economics, but which somehow has positioned itself as this global expert for education, largely on the back of the ubiquity of the PISA test, which is really going from strength to strength all across the world in terms of having more countries and a greater variety of countries involved than ever before. So again, we really run the risk of having one voice of the OECD dictating what should be the case for education all around the world, rather than having a plurality of voices, particularly voices who are most embedded in and responsive to the teaching profession, be it teachers themselves, teacher educators at universities, or the communities in which teachers and their schools and their students are operating. So I think quite often we really do ourselves a disservice if we think one place such as the OECD has all of the answers, because teachers do have immense quantities and qualities when it comes to teacher professional knowledge, teacher professional practice. They really are safeguarders, if you like, of that professional learning that's accumulated over many decades and longer perhaps. So we really need to be encouraging them to draw on that professional learning. They are professionals, they've been to universities, and merely because the OECD says, based on PISA, shouldn't be sufficient reason for them to sort of disregard all of that professional learning, that professional practice, the quality relationships they have with their students and with their peers and with their learning communities and school communities as well. So if you're interested in any of that work, particularly if you're a instructor and you're providing this for your students who are in class in these difficult coronavirus times and they're working remotely, please feel free to contact me. My email address is Stephen with a V, Steven .Lewis, Lewis, at deakin, deakin.edu.au, and I'm happy to provide you with copies of the paper, or I can provide some additional information or like a Q&A type service if that would be handy for your class, or even for you as an individual academic or student out there who's watching this and think, oh, that's interesting, I'd like to know a bit more about how the OECD is working in sort of non-traditional spaces to sort of inform what you do as a teacher, or what you do as a potential teacher leader if you're at university studying a master's or the like. So again, thank you very much for your time. I know these are trying circumstances we find ourselves in, so making a little YouTube video like this from the comfort of the living room is perhaps one small way to provide a little bit of access to the research and the thinking I've been doing, and also generate some sense of community and ongoing conversation while we find ourselves in lockdown all around the world. So thank you very much for your time. Again, reach out if you're interested in the paper. The paper again is at the Journal of Education Policy, Governing Schooling Through What Works, the OECD's PISA for Schools, and I'm happy to share the link to that if you get in contact with me, or you can find it on ResearchGate or academia.edu, any of those online repositories of papers. And I also have another paper, it's coming out just in the coming weeks hopefully, on PISA for You, entitled Providing a Platform for What Works, Platform-Based Governance and the Reshaping of Teacher Learning through the OECD's PISA for You, and that's to appear in the journal Comparative Education. So get in contact, happy to share those, happy to continue the conversation. But most of all, thank you for your attention and your interest in the work I'm doing. Stay safe and look after yourselves and each other, and hopefully we'll get through this, and if nothing else, have a meaningful connection in the meantime around the work of the OECD and PISA and how it is problematic for education all around the world. Thank you very much. Have a good day.